Buenísimo.
Okay.
So we can start with this question: what is the urban? And meaning with this, what do we study when we claim to study the urban, and how it is characterized within a global south perspective? And furthermore, how can and should we come to know the urban?
The urban is, in my view, a condition that characterizes how most of humanity now lives. It means when we live in city or city-like conditions. This is a shared condition for people around the world, but under very different circumstances and understood very differently. There are cultural aspects to it in how urban or urbanized lives are conducted and understood, how people understand their habitat, where they live, how they live. What it means when we say that it's an urbanized condition, it means that they live in a certain way that is connected to larger dynamics happening around the world, that is a life that is connected to other places, that is a life that depends on multiple material support systems, different forms of infrastructure, where it's not just purely local consumption, that it's what characterizes humanity for centuries, if not millennia. So it's not just living in cities, it's living in those city-like conditions, in my view. That's why I take a broad view on urbanization and the urban. It doesn't mean that there's no more rural environments or rural understandings, rural cultures, ways of life. It means that even these places and people are now more directly exposed to these urban dynamics. When we talk about the global south, low and middle income countries, places that somehow are structurally disadvantaged within the global economic system. The disadvantages also manifest in their urban ways of life, the material supports. There are multiple questions about deficits in terms of infrastructure, the topic I research, but also housing, opportunities, livelihoods. But there are also multiple other resources that people need to mobilize constantly to address those deficits. So there's all this inventiveness, for example. There are collectivity, ways of addressing these problems, not just as an individual or as a household, but as part of some social aggregation, some collective. Specifically in Latin America, the region of the world that I study and that I come from, this is quite clear. It's a shared condition, but it's also a very specific condition. And I think we need to balance that interconnectedness of the urban and the conditions of possibility for the urban, the constraints, particularly the economic constraints that the capitalist system imposes, but also understand how this is lived and experienced and how it is understood and how it's even conceptualized. For many years, I studied urbanization in the Brazilian Amazon. When I was doing this, I was also engaging with how Brazilian scholarship engaged with urbanization of the Amazon, not just bringing English language concepts into this research, using the Amazon as my case study, extract data, but also engage with both academic as well as policy and popular understanding of what the urban or urbanization means in this very specific geography of the world.
And I think that leads me to the next question, which is what maybe less known urban theorists from the global south and beyond can maybe help us carry out this anti-colonial, anti-capitalist critique when we try to understand this urban condition. And maybe like if they have been influential to your work in any specific way?
Yes, fortunately, I think those silences are now being addressed. There's this movement for more than a decade now, I think, in Anglo-American scholarship to engage more seriously with urban knowledge from outside Euro-America. There's more material being translated into English, for example, from Portuguese. I was talking about Brazilian scholars. Milton Santos, till very recently at least, the only awardee of the Botrim Lud Prize in geography coming from the Global South, an Afro-Brazilian man, nonetheless, whose work has been recovered, but quite recently. And his urban work is still perhaps not as translated as his other more general geographical theory and economic development work. So Milton Santos' work has been quite influential for me in terms of how I think of urbanization in the Amazon within a clear Brazilian system. Berta Becker, another Brazilian scholar, the one who coined this famous term that the Amazon is an urbanized forest. Another one, Roberto Montemor, who is still based but retired from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Belo Horizonte, the third largest city. So three very important thinkers about urbanization dynamics in the Amazon, writing both in Portuguese and other languages, but largely for their Brazilian audience, and with, until recently, not so much reception in the English-speaking world. There's journals now that fund some translation of urban works. I think that is one way of remedying this silences and those forgotten scholars. There should be more.
You also explore this concept of global urbanization, but you are very careful to frame this embedded in systems of oppression or systems of global inequalities. How does this global urbanization materializes differently in global north areas, in global south areas, but also even understanding that in some middle income countries like the ones that you research, there can be inequalities that also make that you have almost like global north standards and very poor also standards in certain regions.
There's no one type of global north city. If you think about cities in here, Northern Europe, they're very different from cities in Southern Europe, let alone differences with the United States. The same for cities in the global South, low and middle income countries. There's much variation, and I think we need to be very careful about overgeneralization. If you think about city size and this notion of the megacity, which has become very popular, and about megacities being characteristic of the global South. The largest city, urban agglomeration in the world, in my view, and according to some data, some people may not agree, but it's Tokyo, Japan. An urban agglomeration with 50 million people. Japan is one of the world's largest economy, with one of the highest GDPs per capita, and one of the highest levels of human development. Very high life expectancy, very high access to advanced consumption. So this is a huge city. Should we call it a megacity, the way megacities are understood? I'm not sure, right? It's a mega region with very high levels of both economic and human development.
You also research a lot of infrastructure. I wanted to ask you what does the rural and the peripheral mean when now we have all this technological development and a lot of urban initiatives that are redefining also what does the rural and the peripheral is, right? So can you share a little bit with us your views on that?
Absolutely. The rural still exists. As I said earlier in my talk, it's not that we live in a city planet now. The world is urbanized with lots of morphological differences. Many places around the world now feel the impact of cities more clearly, even if they are still largely rural, both in their conditions, their physical development, their cultures, and also how people live their lives. There is a field in Latin American studies I'm familiar with, but also in other regions of the world, that is called new ruralities. I've read quite a bit of this field of new ruralities when I was doing my research on extensive urbanization in the Amazon. I've used some of it also in my work in remote areas, conflict-affected areas of Colombia. And I like the nuance of this field, talk about a new rurality, understanding that the rural is a condition that has shifted, and it means it has a very different meaning now in a largely urbanized world than it had even a few decades ago, right? Rural-urban linkages, rural-urban effects are much stronger and much clearer.
You talked about like all these cleaner zones and initiatives that that can be a new form of sacrifice zones. And you talked in this podcast mainly about the UK and China. But I mean, I could really connect it to Latin America, where I am also from, where there is a lot of also industrial and economic sacrifice zones that have had a really big impact in the environment, in society, I mean, people displaced. And you also talk and investigate about deindustrialization. So I'm wondering how these sacrifice zones, both the ones that knew from before that are so destructive, but also these new green initiatives, what are their implications in this new urban development?
I talked about sacrifice zones in the Urban Radar podcast of the University of Sheffield.
Yeah.
And what I referred in that podcast is with changes in large-scale urbanization and how large-scale urbanization as a mode of development is having an impact on the planetary environment. The meaning of sacrifice zones is now also more broadly. It's no longer places where factories, pollutants were concentrated and they were sacrificed to industrial development. We now have green sacrifice zones we can talk about, zones that are being sacrificed to the goal of sustainability. Places not just in protected, remote forest areas, but places in peri-urban, even urban locations that are dedicated, rezoned, purposely adapted for sustainability purposes, that have very pernicious social consequences in terms of exclusions, removals of people, imposing very uneven costs on different people, and sometimes very large burden on already disadvantaged communities. It's no longer just the remote exclusionary conservation zone, what scholars have called fortress conservation. It's now this special purpose sustainability zones amidst urban regions, largely urbanized regions, that imposing these large burdens on various populations. I'm not against special purpose zones for sustainability, but I think their management, their designation needs to be more democratically decided.
I was looking also that you have been working a lot with also educational and cultural spaces as places where more people can get engaged and have a more of a say in urban development, and hopefully in more democratic and open ways. And with a base on that, like, where do you think future developments are moving towards in Global South urbanisms, or at least in the context that you specialize with?
My current project is working with participatory development of community-scale green infrastructure. I work with an interdisciplinary team in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We're focusing on schools. Buenos Aires is a city with relatively very little green space, very limited amount of green space per person for a city of 3 million residents and 6 million daytime users. Schools in the city, they're very variegated, but many of them are very gray areas. Their schoolyards are literally dead in the sense that there's no vegetation, no biotic elements in them. And we've identified them as a site of opportunity to green the city. The vegetation in school can serve multiple purposes, contribute to the local community in different ways. Not just by, for example, protecting children playing outdoors from air pollutants, but also regulating temperatures, particularly during heat waves or in summer and even spring months when the temperatures are very high now, but also allowing children to understand nature in nature, city children to have much more of what is called nature-based education. Nature-based play contribute to questions of mental health, reducing stress, also for the teachers and school community in general. So these are forms of infrastructure that serve multiple purposes. They are low cost. And it's very important that we need to understand that green infrastructure is not a luxury, it's not just a fashion from the global north that some people like me are trying to introduce in the global south when there are multiple other priorities. No, green infrastructure is one of the components of cities that are going to be resilient and adaptable to the climate emergency. Their cost is very low in comparison to other forms of infrastructure, and they're not alternatives. They are key enhancers of infrastructure development. It's not building a green fence or building a school building. It's not building a house or adding green components. The cost of enhancing these facilities with vegetation is marginal. It's more of a political decision and is an aspect of social awareness.
Lastly, I would like to ask you a question that we have been inviting our guests to share with us. And this is more maybe personal. What is an element from the Global South urbanisms or urban context that you like the most, that maybe identifies you in some way or you find very enriching to learn about?
I think there's much that Latin American urbanisms can offer to the world, particularly in terms of changing things, questioning how authoritarian forms of urbanization operate, producing alternatives from popular movements, popular forms of knowledge, introducing forms of really democratic participation. There's much to learn from how the urban is produced, managed, lived, and studied in Latin America.